Thanks so much for joining me again. I think probably 2 to 3 years after our initial discussion, I think you were episode 13, if I remember correctly. We're now at 52. I'm
Oh,
delighted to
wow.
be chatting to you again here officially, but we've been chatting throughout that time. So yeah, thanks for taking the time to come on and talk all things track and field.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Glenn, one of the things that I've identified about you over the years is that you're very, very methodical with your thinking and how you assemble your ideas in coaching. And I'm assuming, we're going straight into the topics here because people probably are fairly familiar with the first episode and your social media channels. But we'll go into that more in detail. But like your coaching philosophy is, from what I can see and the coaches I've met, pretty robust, I would say. And this might go back into your background and how you kind of assemble that over time. But yeah, you seem to have a pretty solid coaching philosophy, and I'm wondering like really how that came about. Um, yeah, I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I kind of struggle to sit down and say like, write down a sentence of like, what's your coaching philosophy? I hear people say those kind of things and I struggle to kind of come up with maybe an articulate sentence that encapsulates it all. But I think like a lot of importance I attach onto like just making a connection with people and just that, if um, people won't listen to you, won't don't know that you care. If the people don't know that you care, they're not interested in what you have to say too much. So building like good relationships with the people that you're working with is a huge impact on coaching. And that's something I always try to remember. Um, as far as like, some of the principles I tend to live by, I think like technique and like, are you improving technically and are you, you know, is is king, and then trying to make sure that you have a good system technical model for each person that you have makes a big impact on how their health status is and the level that they can get to. So I put a lot of emphasis on trying to make sure that we're moving in the right direction of a high level technical model that stands up under pressure and under big efforts. If you don't have that you're just trying to build up your power numbers and all those kind of physical qualities, but you don't have the technical component in there. I think you're asking for injuries and just stagnation. So I think most of the times I've had people that made really large breakthroughs, it was something technical that they learned over time, and it made a big impact. And that's so I've usually tried to stay like anything that gets in the way of the technique is problem, and focus on those kind of things.
The interesting thing you just said there in the beginning was the relationships piece. I'm wondering, in the beginning of your career, did you have that philosophy on just that component alone, or were you more interested in sharing your knowledge and expecting that the people on the other end were just going to buy into it?
Yeah, when I first came into coaching, I feel like I struggled a little bit with that. I just thought like if I knew a lot of stuff, then people would want to listen to what I have to say and they would believe in it. And I think my first couple coaching jobs, I had struggled with getting to connecting with certain people. And there's some people that just buy in and just yes, coach, and other people, would just, they just didn't they wouldn't buy into all that you said. It was and I think one of the things in my coaching career, you start at a place, and then when you get to switch places, everything's brand new, and you can become the person that you are at that point in time in a new environment, and the mistakes that you made kind of disappear from where you were from before. And if you've learned those things, now you got new people, and they just know you as this new person that's at a higher level than the people that met you before. So, my next jobs, like I said, I went to Central Michigan. I think I got a lot better at just being able to relate to a lot of different people and find just, and it doesn't have to be much. It's just like reaching out to each person to try to get a little feel for what their life is going to be like and what they're motivated by and what they're interested in. And, if you show that you care about them and you're interested in them as a person, then they tend to buy into what you're trying to say. And you have a good, better relationship, and they'll go to bat for you and just do whatever they can to make it successful.
Mm. And between those jobs, like, were you reflecting quite a bit and like maybe even delving into the likes of psychology? Because if I think about how any coach really learns this stuff, you can have experiences and almost be biased towards, well, that person isn't listening to me because they just don't want to work hard enough. You can create all these narratives in your mind, but you've probably seen that, a change in you has shifted a change in them. And so it's not such a quick blanket statement as they just don't want to work hard enough, but it's actually just understanding people more. So I'm interested to know, like, how did you become better at that, really?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right on there. I think that sometimes you'll sort of you'll try different things and they aren't listening to what you're saying or you feel there's that disconnect. And you could kind of make your athletes into your enemy and into enemies in a way, like where you're just kind of thinking like, oh, that person's, just this way, this just that way, and that's why they don't listen. And like I never think that way at all. I think there's always a better way that I'm can change how I'm coming across to them and that it'll make an impact. And so I never put blame onto the athletes. And sometimes that's a fault because you sort of because you just assume it's always on something you have to change. And so sometimes you can feel like and I think I feel like a really high percentage of people that will listen and buy in at this point in my career after I've been through it a long time. But I think you can put a lot on yourself as a coach and it can weigh down your emotions a little bit if you're just always thinking it's on me. But really, I'm the only one that can change. They can choose to change based on how I'm relating with them, but I can't change them. So I have to meet with them where they're at and try to find what motivates them and what excites them and makes them feel a connection to me, so I can get them to listen to what can want to do and go through some hard times possibly, because based on what I'm trying to say, that the things they have to do to be better.
That makes a ton of sense. And I think because you've had that conversion rate over time, like you've reinforced the idea that this approach does work essentially, because I'm sure, as you just mentioned, your buy-in level now is much higher than it would have been in your early days in your career. And that's a very important part that I think, is almost an afterthought for many coaches out there. And I don't know if we really harp on about communication quite enough because, as I think Brett Bartholomew said once in one of his, I don't know, online resources or that is like when you're coaching, you're in the people business. You're not in the science business per se. And I think that's important because it does make sense to when something's not hitting home, maybe you're missing the communication.
Yeah, certainly. And you'll always find those people that connect with you because they're just really interested in the science portion of it, or they want to be coaches maybe themselves, or they're just really fired up about that kind of stuff. And those people might connect with you really easily. But there's not that many people out there that are like that. And if you try to make your whole group thinking they're going to buy into those kind of ideas, you're going to be pretty unsuccessful. And not for lack of knowledge, just because they're not going to do what you ask them to do, and they're not going to be as fired up to do it for you if they don't
Hmm.
know that you care about them and that you're connecting in other ways of their life.
Hmm. I often thought about like why did I start like long jumping seriously because when I was a 16-year-old, I wasn't a motivated person per se. I wasn't doing well in school. I wasn't, the standout, committed athlete that I became probably when I was like 18, 19. And I thought a lot about why that was. And my first coach did a great job of nurturing us in a very community focused environment. So we would go there and do hard things in training, but it was essentially pitched to us in such a way where we were just working with our friends, we were
Mhm.
able to have that social connection within that. And I think that shows a lot of what maybe the early stages for a lot of athlete development needs to have in that you can't just show up and have these very scientific or technically focused workouts and it will just magically turn into again, very hardworking athletes, but rather there's a lot more to it. There's that community, there's that social dynamic that you really need to pay close attention to, or as it's called oftentimes now, culture.
Yeah, and and if they feel comfortable with you, that they know that you care, they're willing to share some other information that might really help you and help the science portion of it too. If they trust you and know that you're not going to condemn them because they feel tired today or because something you designed in the training wasn't quite right and they felt extra fatigued or whatever it is. If they don't feel comfortable to express that to you, then you're not going to be able to get the science part of it and the great training plan either because you're not going to be able to adapt. So. It goes both ways, and that relationship you have with them has a huge impact on what you can do and how you can make good decisions for each individual person.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Back on the kind of more, I suppose, coaching philosophy, and when people hear that, they often think obviously about, the technical side and the training planning and everything like that. I do believe on our last episode, you did go back into your educational background and you did a master's in exercise science at UT quite a few years ago, and I'm wondering, like, did the content within that kind of provide some robust principles and guardrails for like nowadays, especially when we're seeing all this stuff online, like if you're not a very, very well educated person in your hard sciences and things like that, you're liable to fall into so many different traps. And again, as I said, you're one of the people that has a more robust sense of, I suppose, self when it comes to this sort of stuff. And I'm not saying that you're not open to new ideas and things like that, but rather like you stick to your principles. And I'm wondering, like, does that have a root in your education?
Yeah, every time I'm coming up with a training plan or a technical idea, I think it comes back somewhat towards to things you learned in science through my education. When my undergraduate in Canada, I did like 4 levels of biomechanics, and I took engineering and physics and some. If I'm kind of coming up with a principle of like, or something that I'm looking for and it doesn't look quite right, I'm often looking for a physics and biomechanics kind of reason as to why it's not working. So flight times and angles and things like that that I think I could see pretty well after having done that kind of research. And then it also comes down to understanding an anatomy and how the body works. And um, I think every time I'm coming up with a theory to try to solve a problem, it comes back to those kind of principles. And um, otherwise, it's kind of easy just to fall into just, well, let's try this and let's try that, and just where there isn't a real plan in place. And if you don't have a good theory of why you need to change something, then you're really just random chance that it's going to work out. So I think having a good science background definitely helps. But if you just drop a scientist out on the track, it's not going to work. I mean, you have to have the understanding of and how to teach um, and just and principles about how to teach and how to get things across. It's just you need to understand the mechanics to have a theory out there you can test out, and then if it didn't work, then you come up with another theory. And so I think you know, you just develop your eye over time and then gauge it towards but having a theory in place about how to get you there based on
Hmm.
science and can definitely helps.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if the early days of your coaching, did your philosophy look very much the same as now? Has anything really shifted much?
Yeah, early in my philosophy, so I would look at some technical thing and try to have that person copy those technical things. And I might have a vision of what they wanted to do, but I didn't understand how to teach someone to get there, so to speak. So we were often trying to get in maybe positions instead of like how why they were not in positions, things like along those kind of ideas. I had a very good idea of what it should look like at a high level, but as far as how to teach it and how the cause and effect and how to get there, I didn't have a very good understanding of. And it's just like so you sometimes you start looking at like, well, why can't that person do it? And almost like it's their fault because they don't understand or aren't able to copy something maybe that someone elite people do. And then over time, you start to build an eye and build a sort of a flow chart, a technical flow chart of if this, then, and if that, then go this direction. And it takes a while to build that in there. And I think a lot of the coaching education, like it focuses on a lot of like key principles of what needs to happen, but there isn't a lot of how to see it and like, is that person seeing it and changing? There's a lot of
Mm.
information out there, but there's not a lot of the kind of this is how to see it, and this is the flow chart of if this is happening, then you got to do this. And coaches develop that over time. And maybe that's kind of an organic process that just has to happen over a lot of experience. But I felt like in my early coaching career, I knew a lot of stuff, but I didn't know how to get it across and how to get the average person to to do it.
Hmm. Yeah, I felt the same, before I actually came to ULM, to be honest. Like I'd watch long jumpers for years before I came to ULM, and it wasn't really until I met yourself that I understood or began to understand cause and effect. Like so if let's say my acceleration was very low and I got stuck at transition, I kind of felt like there was a few stumble steps in there. I wouldn't really know where to go back and trace the roots of the mistake I made, if that makes sense. And it seems like it's kind of in line with what you're saying there.
Yeah, if you're stepping out wide to the side or you're stumbling, there's probably a situation where you don't have enough flight time to get your body positioned in the right way to make that next step. And if you just try to correct the stumble and, I just got to put my leg straight or something like that, it's just not going to work. You still have the same flight time issue that's not going to allow you to express the pushes to get in the right positions. So, um, it's you have to, if you have a good scientific background of those kind of things and a cause and effect, like it makes a big difference in your ability to problem solve. And that's really what it is. It's not trying to like fit someone into what elite people do. It's like, what do they do and how can you manipulate it a little bit in order to get closer to an ideal model for them?
Hmm. I always noticed as well that like when you were at meets, you'd be taking notes on a lot of different things that you were probably seeing, although I never looked particularly. But I'm interested, it seems like you were making all sorts of observations of, their interpersonal kind of body language and whatnot, but also probably the technical things. Do you think that kind of enabled you to, start to draw these patterns up and solve those problems as time went on in your coaching career?
Yeah, you see certain things like when people in situations, they tend to make certain mistakes or react in certain ways. And so, yeah, I was always trying to like come up with a theory of why that what I was seeing was happening. So, it might be something that when someone's really jammed into the long jump, they do this particular motion, or when they're out, they tend to do this. When they're it just there's certain things that people do and you see the technical errors that make mistake, and I was always trying to find a pattern about what that would be, so I would take notes about that, and then I might look at them a few weeks down as I'm looking at the next meet with them and I'm trying to figure out what they tend to do in these situations. And after you've seen 60, 80 athletes over time doing similar things, you start to get maybe a better flow chart about what's going to happen and what people's tendencies are. And then you come up with different theories, and often they hold up true. And if they don't, then you're going, well, why is this person a little different? And then you come up with a new theory that's just maybe a sub direction of that same flow chart that might help them out, and a new reason why. And over many, many years, you start to build a good model of how to teach it and some of the errors that people make and why they make them.
And it shows why it's so important to have your mentors like Dan and Boo and everyone like that, that you're kind of starting to assemble these patterns so you can kind of go, hey, I don't know if you've experienced this, but if an athlete is doing this, what would you typically, kind of, yeah, what would you cause that to, or what would you attribute that to is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, certainly. And I'm often on I would be sending a text message to Dan or an email to Dan or Boo, and just like, have you seen this? What do you think about that? And of course, almost every time there'd be of course, yeah, this is why, and this is what, and I'd have my own theories, and to be able to confirm it with people that are kind of the greats of the sport was a pretty valuable part of my career. And it's just it's interesting. You'll often solve these problems yourself, and then it's everything you've done is something that someone else has already done most of the time.
Mhm.
And so it's good to
One
have
thing
people to back it up, to go back to and confirm some of your ideas too.
One thing we've been talking a lot about lately is, the long jump takeoff mechanics, or should I say the steps leading into it. And one thing you said recently to me is kind of that overemphasis on horizontal pushing as you come into the board leaves traces when you actually plant a takeoff. Do you want to, yeah, give me a bit more insight into what you've kind of observed there as one of your kind of causal connections?
Yeah, I'm always looking at running technique, and I think that what happens at the takeoff and in the penultimate step is so much based on what's happening before that. So, whenever I'm looking at someone, I want to try to get a good model of their running technique. And that's one of the first things we try to go. And, I spend my fall trying to get the technical model down, instead of thinking about trying to make good fitness or all those kind of things. And that's part of it. But, I'm trying to teach on day one on good mechanics so that when we get to the, doing full approach type stuff, that they're capable of doing what I ask them to do. Um, but when someone's running into the board, if they're coming in and their shins are tilted, kind of back, or their butts out, their posture, those things tend to go together. So if someone's coming in with their butt out and their shins are tilted in like a negative direction coming into the board, when they're lowering on a penultimate, they tend to going to stab behind them and stick their foot out and block on a takeoff, for instance. So if you teach their mechanics. Sometimes you could teach someone great mechanics, and then when they get into the board, they do the same kind of thing. So just making sure that it holds up under the pressure of a board of running in and taking off, for instance. And there's different little tendencies that different people have. And some of them will kind of baffle you, and you wonder where they came from. And you might talk to that person and try to figure out, like, what are your ideas? What were you taught? And sometimes it's a well-meaning coach that maybe told them things that weren't necessarily accurate, and you have to undo some of that thing. So sometimes it's individual characteristics of them that leads them to do certain mistakes. Um, so when someone's coming into the board, you want to see a little bit of a bounce in the run. Should be going a little bit up and down, and that gets amplified by the penultimate and the takeoff. Um, and sometimes people will be told like they need to quicken coming into the board, and then so they spin and lose all of that kind of bounce kind of feeling, and then they have a hard time setting up the takeoff. So how do they do it? Maybe they step out on the penultimate to try to create a little more air time and stick their foot out and don't run through the board so well, so they lose a lot of horizontal velocity. There's so many different things that people can do to mess it up, so to speak. So it's how do they lower coming into it? It's some people have a misconception of how much they need to squat lower onto the penultimate, so they'll squat extra hard on the penultimate and then blocking and losing a lot of horizontal speed as well. There's so many different things that people can do. Another one people will do is they'll come on 3 steps out and go up really high and then lower onto the penultimate, trying to create a little extra bounce. There's so many different things that people can do, and when you're trying to solve those problems, I think you got to get into their head a little bit and say, why do they do that? And sometimes they might not know, and it was just something that was drilled into them in the past, or just a way that they solved the problem. And you have to kind of dive in and try to figure out why they want to do those things. And sometimes it's a physical thing, sometimes it's an old motor pattern that was put onto them that they need to change.
Hmm.
Um, mm.
Do you use like coach check marks to kind of, I suppose, find an optimal balance of where that kind of technical model can look most stable, or, I say optimal, I guess, yeah, to execute optimally. So you mentioned the bounce and the run there. If you have coaches check marks, which I mean, when we were working together, you did, that will give you I suppose, a landmark for how they'll be coming into the takeoff.
Yeah, there's an optimal stride length that you find out for each person. So, using a 4 or 5 or even a 6-step coach's mark can give you a little more information about that. So if you've been working for someone for a while, you kind of get a feeling for how big their steps need to be in order for them to set up a takeoff. So, I'd often use those things, and on some days where it's not lining up, but they're still on the board, then I know um, that's probably why, the way their run is, I need to try to change it in order to get more to get them in the right spot that they feel comfortable to do a takeoff. And sometimes they're just going to be a little jammed, and that's how they look best on that particular day. And sometimes they look a
Hmm.
little better when they're a little bit out. And so that's where the art of coaching comes in, is to figure out how to work with it on the day. And sometimes there's something that you'll see that day, and then okay, well, we need to change this tomorrow, but we got to get our best jump out today. So we're going to work with what we got.
Yeah, yeah, totally. On the penultimate side of things, like it's a weird kind of topic because I feel like it's not talked about too much because it is so cause and effect. Like what you see before it will essentially, dictate what happens on it. But going from penultimate to takeoff, like, do you want to kind of see? I suppose one way to hash this out a bit more is to talk about flight paths, and if you over lower, then your flight path onto the takeoff might be higher or lower depending on how it happens. But a good kind of roadmap is to know what the flight path should look like. And I'm interested to know what your ideas on that.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time lately just thinking about the path of the center of mass and how someone comes into the takeoff in a long jump, especially. I've also thought a lot of it with hurdles as well. But when you want to see that subtle bounce, and the high points are where they're flying in the air, and the low points are where in the mid stance of the ground.
Hmm.
So I want to I'll sometimes use a background, like a line that I might see behind their head to get an idea of what they're doing and how much rising or falling. So you might look at your stadium and you see a fence line or something like that, and you can use some part of their body to line up with that fence and see how they are moving, how the path of the center of mass is moving. So based on their head or their a hip or shoulder or something like that. Um, so I want to see when they're going on to the penultimate. Most of the lowering happens when they're going on to the penultimate. And I want to see someone with their foot flat and their chest up. A lot of times people will squat in the penultimate. They'll kind of lean forward and try to get real low and have a lot of knee bend. But when you do that, you're going to tend to cause a lot more braking when you're planting your foot on the board, or you'll just slow down on that step. So I want to see them put their foot flat, and when they leave the ground on that step, they should do just a subtle rise, but it won't be as much of a rise on that step as on the previous running steps. So they should go fairly level or even downwards, going from the penultimate to the takeoff. And sometimes people will kind of sit on the penultimate and they'll lower actually on the foot with their foot on the ground and lower while they're on that the ground contact, and that can cause a lot of excessive lowering, and it'll slow it in your flight time going on to the takeoff, but you'll probably block and lose a lot of horizontal velocity when you do that, and it might trade off to some extra vertical, but you're usually going to use a lot of speed, so you should see a slight subtle lowering. And when you look at all the greats and the biomechanical studies, when you see it, you'll see when they touch down from when they leave the ground on the penultimate step to when they touch down on the takeoff, they're pretty much level or even lower when they put their foot down. So, and then when their foot comes down, if someone does squat on the penultimate and can stick their foot out a little bit, they'll tend to rise almost as soon as their foot hits the board. So you'll see their hips rise up, and that means they're losing a lot of horizontal speed. So what you want to see is they'll put their foot down and they'll go forward a little bit and then up.
Mm-hmm.
And when their hip passes their foot, then you see more rise.
Mm-hmm.
But if you stuck your foot out and blocked, you'll tend to rise almost instantly as soon as your foot hits the ground. And if you do that, you're losing a little bit even just by where you're leaving the ground, because hips are not going to be as past the board. In a long jump, that does make quite a difference. If you leave the ground and your foot is, uh, you know, 40 centimeters behind you, just throwing a number out there, or 30 centimeters, that 10 centimeters that you actually, it makes a huge difference. Um, and there's a whole lot more to it than that, but there's also the speed that you're going to gain by moving through and up. So um, and those kind of things, it's neat to see from the side, and you can get a lot of information on that about what people are doing and how they're solving the problem of taking off. And there's some good solutions that keep a lot of horizontal velocity and are really valuable, and other ones that make you kill it.
Have you found that there are like general cues that tend to tidy up like 90% of the issues when it comes to this? Obviously, there is some individuality, as you mentioned, like athletes having certain backgrounds, but if you stabilize, again, just that bounce in the run through that check mark and get an optimal stride length, after having some time with them, that will kind of, I suppose, yeah, it'll be the kind of virus, if you will, for what other problems might not manifest as a result.
Yeah, I mean, just if you stabilize it where you know that how a person comes in, and it's within plus or minus 30 centimeter or 15 centimeters or half a foot, if they tend to be in that area, and then they're usually going to do similar things. Um, and each person has the tendencies that can be a little bit confusing at times. But it solves a lot of problems when you've got a standardized distance that you're used to seeing them at. And once you can get them to that spot, then there's more to it as far as how they're moving and on a particular day or whatever the conditions might be leading to that. But,
Hmm. Yeah. And back on the penultimate, like, are you looking for that kind of bridge position as it's often described? I know some people have a tendency to maybe roll with the shin as their foot is fully grounded. Um, and thus that is a kind of braking motion, if you will, going into the takeoff. Like, how do you begin to, I suppose, tackle that sort of problem as well and get them into, yeah, more of a rolling kind of motion?
yeah, so I want to see them lowering more from just basically going from a ball of the foot to a flat foot. and a
Mm,
subtle bend in the knee and a subtle bend in the hip with keeping the upper body up. And then, it depends on the person. Some people that are used to kind of lowering a lot before the penultimate or onto the penultimate, they'll tend to be in worse positions of kind of squatty kind of movements and things like that. And then they'll have little different tendencies about what they might do with the next step. But I want to see them put their foot flat and very really upright. Um, if you fix that on someone that tends to squat a lot onto the penultimate, then you'll leave them in a position where they kind of can't feel anything and they don't know what to do. So I'll tell them instead of lowering onto the penultimate so much, try to lower after it.
mm,
So they'll leave their foot on the ground and try to move downwards into the takeoff. And so, you won't see as an extension of the leg as much. They'll leave the ground. That foot will land flat and they'll tilt over in the shin and they won't extend the knee.
mm,
They'll just lower down into it. And other things you might see with people is just where their body position is if they lean back a lot. A lot of times people will lean back going to the takeoff and then they'll just stay there. And so they're not running through the board and they'll get a lot of height and they'll maybe sometimes they're anticipating flight mechanics or landing mechanics and try to land in a good position. So they'll almost do that when they're on the board. So they'll lean back, put their foot down and just kind of stay back there. And they lose so much about the forward rotation and when we're doing a big jump, there should be a lot of forward rotation and we have to find ways to solve the problem. Um, but sometimes people try to solve the problem before it's even started. And
mm,
so they'll lean back and just try to land almost in the air, on the ground, sorry, before they've even flown. So, when you want to create that forward feeling of, oh my gosh, am I going to fall? And then you try to solve it.
mm,
And it takes a lot of courage to jump like that too. There's sometimes that people personalities are almost they're just kind of safe people in general, and they have a hard time feeling that. And you have to coax them into it, encourage them, and reward them when they do take that risk. And sometimes what'll happen, they'll do that, they'll go forward, and they'll land in a big heap of mess, and you're going like, and they're coming out of the pit, and they're like, oh, my landing that was so bad. And you go, awesome, I'm rewarded. I'm telling them, what an awesome jump, that was great. And we just need to solve that problem in the air next time. So I think rewarding when you're seeing those good takeoffs, because and some person will be really hard on themselves. The same type of person that wants to land real pretty will tend to not take risks at the board, and so they'll might land in a big mess in the landing, and they're thinking it's bad, but you're going, wow, that was awesome, and I'm rewarding them and telling them how great it was. And it's funny, I've seen some people that'll land all just terrible because they did such an amazing takeoff that was so much better than they'd done. The jump is further, even if it does look messy.
mm,
But you'll see that in a meet, but they might not see it in practice. So if you keep encouraging them to do a big takeoff where they're being risk takers and diving out there, you'll see big results. But there's other people that'll kind of anticipate it. They'll lean forward going into the takeoff, and then they get over rotate and get kind of sloppy jumps too. So
mm.
you've got to look at some people's tendencies and kind of come up with a theory of how you need to get them into more good model.
Mm. Those are two good archetypes, yeah, for sure. They're contrasting, but I think that shows how you need to be flexible with your solutions essentially. I'm interested to know if you found anyone in the world kind of scene at the moment that does those things very, very well, like someone you've been watching and you're just like, yeah, they tend to, pretty much do this at an expert level.
Yeah, I someone like I like watching Glow. He looks kind of awkward, and just some things he does. His running isn't really pretty, and he's kind of uncoordinated, almost looking. But when you look at the last four steps into the runway, the way he's running into the board, and the freedom that he has on takeoff, he's just a huge risk taker, and he has quite a history of that personality type. If you look at his background and
Mm,
jumping off buildings and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. So that's someone that's a big risk taker, and you can see it when he takes off. He just runs through, and there's no fear of the flight and the speed coming in. There's other tendencies people have where they'll run in and they'll kind of be safe and slow on the penultimate and then that causes a lot of problems too. He does none of that. He just carries it right through, and he might not have as much athletic ability as some of the other guys, but he gets a whole lot out of himself on every jump, and he's fun to watch because he's a risk taker that has a lot of fun competing.
yeah, yeah. I actually only really thought about that recently when I was at that coaching conference in Sweden. I remember someone doing a presentation just talking about how his background in parkour being so fundamental to what you see in the last round of these competitions because, if you think about it, he's been in scenarios where he's jumping over a building that he could possibly die and like
Yeah.
there's no alternative. Like it's make the jump, and no wonder he can go into an Olympic final and be so stoic and just be like, "Pff," you know. This is just a jog in the park compared to what I've done.
Oh yeah, yeah. He's taken big risks in his life, and so, something like, losing a long jump competition or something that's pretty small. So he takes big risks when he jumps, and it's cool to watch someone. And I think that the someone you think about personality types and maybe the type of jumping techniques they use too. And a 2.5 hitch kick is one of those ones where you're leaning back, diving out, jumping through and being free and just figure it out, right? And that suits his personality. And I think sometimes I've had some success where you have someone that's a bit of a safe person, and they do maybe a sail or a hang, and then you change them to a hitch kick just for fun, just to see what happens. And all of a sudden, they do this amazing takeoffs that are so different, and you maybe capture a different aspect of their personality that makes them enjoy it more, and then they learn from it. So sometimes I just play around with trying different things, especially in the fall, and just see what people gravitate to and just have fun and experience different things. And I don't know, never, I try not to be ever married to it. It's like my idea that they're going to go this way, but it's a lot of fun to experiment and see what comes out. And that different movement experience of someone that's been doing something so many times over so many years, sometimes it'll unlock something in them that's totally new and special. And then they'll get a breakthrough when they've been stuck for a long time.
Yeah, you had a few of those in UCF. Like you had people that converted to that kind of 1.5 hitch kick and a walk in as well. I'd be interested to know, like in those instances, um, yeah, what made you go there, and then what happened, because they are actually very very good kind of case studies for what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I used to be really married to the idea, and it was always drilled into me with some of my mentors, and for good reason, that with a walk-in, for instance, just make it simple and repeatable, um, and it's going to, and it'll take away a lot of your accuracy issues with the board and those kind of things. And I agree with a lot of those ideas. I think when you do something like a preliminary movement, like a walk-in or a skip or something like that, as long as it's kind of reined in, it lets you run, push at the start of the run and be a little calmer. Um, it also helps you get your head up a little bit earlier so that you can see the board and make adjustments. So I used to be really rigid about it, and I started having a few people that were kind of hard-headed and were just, I thought like this isn't worth messing with right now, so I let them do it. And they were surprisingly good at tracking and finding the board, even if they were off. And so I started letting people do some of that stuff and just see where it went. And then I always had it in my back pocket that I didn't like it, I could change it. But that's one thing, as you get a little more experience, you're a little more comfortable trying different things in some ways too. Where I was just so like, by the book, this is what you got to do. And I just felt like sometimes people would just be working so hard at the back, and they'd be trying to line up all these angles, and everything was just like there was a lot of force. And then when they get to the board, they did a little stiffer and felt like they had done too much work almost, while they're tired when they get there. And when someone did a little bit of a walk in or a skip in, so some of my people at UCF had came to me to just be like, "Hey, can I try this?" And before I was really against it, and then if someone I had trusted them that they were pretty good at tracking, and I thought they were pretty disciplined in their personalities, how they would do the back. Then I just started letting them do it, and then I started having some really good success with it. And in some ways, they were better. They'd have more good days in just general practices. So like, well, maybe this fits. And and interesting. I felt like with some of those people, they actually were more accurate when they did do a skip in, and I don't know why. I don't know why, but we had better jumps than regular. So I don't, and some of my people did a push out, and they were really accurate and they did a great job. But having that flexibility was really valuable. And yeah, as far as like, I've had some people that Jasmine Scott Kilgo was one that, in her situation, she tended to squat a lot on the penultimate and slow down on the penultimate and kind of power it. So one day we're at practice, and it was kind of an inopportune time. It was right before conference, actually. And I was getting frustrated because he was just squatting on it and I couldn't get her to change. And I was just like, okay, I want you to pretend to be Ivana Spanovich. You pretend to be her, like you're an actor in a movie and you're Ivana Spanovich. And so she went up there, did a hitch kick, and it looked just like Ivana Spanovich. In the same way, she has like one arm a little bit off and it's not all lined up perfectly. She looked exactly like that. And it was a pretty good, effective landing. And then so we kept playing, playing that role and seeing how it went. And when we go to the meets, it was interesting. I didn't had no attachment to what it was. If she, I didn't have an idea like I'm gonna make her into a hitch kicker and it's gonna solve all our problems. I wanted her to experience a different movement, and if it cleaned up the way she ran off the board and the speed that she carried from the penultimate to the takeoff, and it made her, you know, not throw her head and lean back at the takeoff and just dive into the jump, then maybe it would carry over when she did the hang. I was not attached to the idea. And so, sure enough, I mean, what had tended to happen was she would hitch kick in practice pretty much every time. And we'd go to the meet, and sometimes she'd hitch kick, sometimes she would hang. And it just kind of went with it, whatever it was. And I never even pointed it out to her what she did or didn't do. Maybe
Hmm.
after the meets, I would. We'd talk about it because I thought it was interesting what had happened. But
Hmm.
it changed the way she took off, and she started having a big breakthrough. In the year that we did that, the next year, she went from, 620, PR was like 622 to 638, and had some big jumps that make she think she could have jumped much further than that too. And I think a lot of it was the fact that she solved that technical problem by a new movement pattern. And I've had interesting situations too. Ashira Collins was ones that I taught her long jumping. She was a kind of mediocre long jumper in high school, didn't do too much of it. And whatever day we talk about different techniques, and sometimes she would hang, sometimes she would sail, sometimes she would hitch kick. And I didn't know quite what was going to come out on the day, and I just let her do it. And I just coach a hitch kick one day, and some day I'd coach a hang. And eventually she solved and went into like a 1.5 hitch kick. Um, but I just wanted to experience the different feelings and let her solve the problem of landing. And sometimes when she'd get a little over rotated, it'd look more like a hitch kick. And other times, if she was leaning back, it would look more like a hang. And I tried not to be married to the technique, just whatever
Hmm.
happened, happened. And
Yeah.
it made a big difference in both their careers.
And I'm interested to know with that kind of hitch kick idea, do you think that then corrected some of the steps that were leading into the takeoff? So for Jasmine, like who was like lowering a lot coming into the jump, did she then begin to not do that as much anymore and hence kind of um lost less speed essentially?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, when she was one that when I first got her, her upright running mechanics weren't very good. And then it got better over time until the end, after I'd worked with her for 5 years, I had 4 years even, I thought she had really outstanding upright mechanics. But what happened, she first learned to run nicely, and then when she come into the board, she would kind of lose it and squat coming into the takeoff and run kind of low the steps coming in. So I just taught her to have a little more bounce in the run. And when we started doing the hitch kick just for fun, she started carrying speed through those steps. She was taller. She used to lean back a lot at takeoff and um, just lean back and stay there a little bit. And then when I taught her to hitch kick, she was able to create a little rotation. She had a new solution to solve it. And so that it unlocked some different things in her takeoff. And I had some other people that had a similar experience, and some that you wouldn't think were maybe meant to be hitch kickers, if you know what I mean. But
Mm-hmm.
they started doing it and had really good success. So I'm not attached to any one technique. It just whatever solves the problem and gets the most out of the athlete. So yeah, just having some confidence after you've been doing this for a long time that it'll be okay. We can experiment a little bit and I'll be able to figure it out.
Hmm. On the more training organization front, like it's an interesting one nowadays because we almost see on social media particularly like an emphasis on those physical metrics like running fast, jumping high, jumping long, and lifting heavy. That they're all parts of the equation of becoming a good jumper, if you will, and you mentioned that. But when you kind of get away from the core technical principles, you do end up causing sometimes a lot of damage, injuries being one and performance being the other. But how you shape your week, do you kind of, I suppose, in your mind go through what is priority given the time of year and start to manipulate the variables accordingly? And that is because you have a good idea in your mind of what is, most important in your philosophy, I guess.
Yeah, I think that it's really important when we need to get stronger, we need to be faster, we need all those qualities. It's really important. When I first started, I kind of, I wanted to find out like, okay, what does Walter Davis do in the 30 meters, and what does he squat, and what do you do for standing long jump? And thinking like almost if I check those boxes off, then I was going to create Walter Davis based on numbers that he did in training. And it didn't work that way. It never worked that way. And what would happen sometimes you're thinking like, okay, well, guys that jump 8 meters, they squat 400 pounds, and you see so much of that. And that's common, it actually is. But how you get there and how they got there can be very different ways. And when you're seeing someone at 28 years old that does a 400-pound squat, it's a lot different what they might have been doing when they're in college too. So yeah, I had a little more. Um, I was often wrapped up in kind of numbers that really don't mean too much. When I'm designing training programs, I want to see a balance of all the qualities. And I tend to use a complex training method where the week looks pretty similar at the beginning of the year to what it does at the end. We tend to work on the same things, it's just in slightly different ways to maybe control the intensity of it all. But when you look at a training program on day one, we're working on acceleration, we're working on max speed mechanics. We're not maybe in spikes smashing it, but we're doing good mechanics and teaching that. And I think if you sacrifice the technical components by trying to get a big squat or trying to get a big numbers or big clean, you're sacrificing a lot on technique, because it takes a while to recover from that stuff. So my week setups, I might put it later in the week, right? On a Friday, maybe versus if I do it on Monday, then we're doing short approaches the next day. I'm probably not going to be able to get much of a result from that person. Now I've wasted a day of improving their technique. So I think it's important to hit those things. But if I put it on Friday and then I've got Saturday of a recovery type day and a Sunday off, and then Monday starts, and we're doing shorter accelerations out to say 30 meters, I can hit it pretty hard on Friday. And then we come back on Monday, we can still have a pretty good acceleration type day. But even then, with those 3 days, if I put a max speed session on Monday, after we did that really hard squatting on Saturday, we might not be ready to, or Friday, say, we might not be ready to hit it and have as good of a session. So I'm always thinking of one, how a workout might help to promote what I'm doing the next day, or might get in the way of having a good session. And what I always come back down to is, is this person improving technically? Are they getting to a new higher level? And when you have someone maybe that's really experienced, that's been, a 30-year-old athlete that has a good technical model, and maybe you've been with them for a long periods, you might be able to sacrifice a little bit of that learning because it's already in place pretty good. Um, but when a lot of the people that I've tended to work with have been younger, where I'm trying to make a good model for them. And if I get in the way of trying to, get some silly number and, oh, I need a big squat and I need a big deadlift or whatever it is, I'm often hampering the learning process. And I think I've been in a lot of situations where you're you, you're building all these physical qualities and you think it's going to lead to something, but you really go back. Did they really learn, and did they really improve, and did they improve that thing?
Hmm.
And often it's the answer is I was kind of led astray trying to hit some fancy number that really didn't lead to anything.
Hmm. Yeah, I talked with a coach recently who I've had on the podcast before, and I was talking a little bit about like improving rate of force development at takeoff, because we know that an elite long jumper can essentially take off at a certain velocity or has to apply force in a said time frame. And I was kind of expecting like a solution to be, around the physiological side. And the coach replied, well, what does the takeoff mechanics look like? And if, you can't, I suppose, check off X, Y, and Z box on that front, then are you not just putting a band-aid on the wound, essentially, which I found to be a very, very good way to look at it. And again, I think that's a lot of what social media can sometimes promote is, there's a physiological solution for what is a technical problem, but in actuality, being able to revise exactly what's happening and starting there and keep, prioritizing that is really what you need to do first and foremost. And then, as you say, if you're with a 30-year-old athlete who's got, the icing on the cake in a lot of these areas, and you're just trying to squeeze that last bit of lemon out of the juice, then, sure, maybe take a different approach.
Yeah, yeah, I think, you can create a lot of big power, create all these numbers, and sometimes people get to really high levels doing things that aren't very good, if they're not technically good, but they got a big engine and they do some things pretty well. You'll see some people do some amazing things. They tend to have kind of short windows, though. They'll tend to get injuries because of those techniques, because they block a lot of takeoff, and so they start getting the knees and ankles and Achilles problems and things like that because of the way they're doing it. And if they've got physical tools, they've got the speed and they can figure out the way to do it, but it tends to have a cost in there. And I think for me, it always comes down to technique, and you know, when you've had situations like I had over years where maybe someone can't do training because maybe some injury or something like that, and you have to miss a lot of time and take a lot of things away. And they look at the end of the year and they're like, oh, they still got a lot better. And I missed all that training. I missed all that stuff. And I thought was going to make all the difference. And, a situation like someone starts training in January and they're just doing plan Bs all fall. And they still have a huge year in PR by 20 centimeters. You're like, well, what was the big thing that made that difference? And maybe a lot of time it's just that they executed a lot better. And so they have, but they missed so much training, you wouldn't think that they would be able to get better. And so then you start looking at it and you go like, well, do we really need this? Do we really need that? And what are the costs of those things? And sometimes you could spend all fall trying to build all these special qualities, and then go into the season and you've run out of time because you can't work on the technical things because you're trying to get a 400-pound squat, and so you had them squatting twice a week, and now their body is in bad shape and in bad positions, and then they don't get the result you had. And so much of it is executing nice technique. And I think if you try to expand one quality to really high levels, it throws the balance off of the system, and then it can cause a whole lot of problems, and you can't learn as well because maybe your body is not in the right positions it should be because you had a big cost. And sometimes it's also excessive volumes of tempo training or something.
Mm.
Um, I used to be obsessed with some of the numbers. So you'd see like, okay, are we getting better? Are we doing 6 200s at 30, and now we're doing it at 29 or doing it at 28? And at some point I threw all that away and I was just like, I don't really care. It's not what we're trying to work on.
Mm.
So I started running on the grass, and just for time, and I didn't time anyone. We just have a certain time we were running. We were running 4, and I wanted to execute while, and I let them have some freedom about how hard they were running. And as long as I didn't feel someone was really slacking, then I just let them figure out what that was, and could they execute technically for that whole 20, 30 seconds.
Mhm.
But and I didn't have anything to measure how well they were improving over time, and I didn't really care. That's not what we were trying to do, you know. But doing excessive volumes of tempo and medium type um, effort work will cause some problems as well. That makes it harder for you to execute technically. And the technique is what drives the big performance breakthrough to me.
Hmm. Yeah, it really does go back to the very beginning of our conversation, talking about philosophy and that, you know, being attached to true experience or uh, disassociating almost from the tempo stuff, the weights, etc., makes you realize really what matters, and that your philosophy now, given the fact that you had those experiences, is now rooted in fewer variables, which is in your experience largely due to the technical model, which is it's very interesting, and I've even found that just if I look at my years and see what performances happened and what was, stable and what wasn't so stable. I could probably attribute it to similar things such as what you've mentioned, and it's very interesting because you know it is just getting into practice in those cases and doing the reps mindfully. If you're alongside a coach and have someone that can help you with that, that's brilliant. But like you know, being able to do 10 reps quality in certain ways, i.e., doing them technically proficiently versus gassing up 6 and them being sloppy, but maybe because your intention was to jump far, is a totally different thing. And thus the outcome in the season is totally different as well, which is it's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to have a vision for what I think someone might look like technically over time. I think, or by the end of that year, trying to solve the problems to take there. And I'm not going to sacrifice anything to get it. I need to see if I can teach them to do the things they need to learn, and I don't want to sacrifice much for that. And sometimes that's maybe simplifying things, because sometimes the physical tools that you build allow you to do some of the technical things, and
Hmm.
so we can't ignore those. But I don't want to sacrifice them and be going backwards for very long periods of time. So I just like I have a model of what I need them to get to, and I think about how do I organize the training and how are they learning and are they going that right way? And if they're
Mhm.
not, then I'm evaluating. So it always comes down to like, are they executing better? And sometimes it takes a little time, and you can be saying the right things for months and months and even a few years sometimes. And if you just stick to your guns and do what you think is right, often it works out. And sometimes it doesn't go on the same timeline that I hope it will, but I think I'm usually right on how it looks like and how that person is going to look like over the long term. And when they get there, the result comes.
Mhm. Yeah, I reflected like just on a few years ago where I had a particularly hard training set up and I had approaches on Friday, and how I had set the week up was really, really hampering um, the approaches, which is just so interesting. And I'll be fully frank here in that I didn't notice it at the time, but when I went back at the video, I'm like, damn, every Friday I did approaches, like I was stuck in the mud. And that was because of the things I did on the Wednesday and the Monday. Um, and then I asked myself, well, is the approach very important in long jump? The answer is yes,
Yeah.
and my, I suppose, setup in the week prior to that session was completely debilitating my ability to do the most important thing on that Friday.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's more important than your approach when you're a long jumper, right? That's how that generates the whole jump. And if you've sacrificed too much to try to build up these qualities and you can't execute, and it takes a lot of reps to do those things well and be able to make a model, a good model, and repeat it enough times so that it's stable under pressure and that you can repeat it over and over. So, I try not to waste time. And that's, so I'm starting on like, September, maybe not doing full approaches, but I'm creating what I want them to look like later in the year. And so on, day one, we're doing accelerations and it's, we're trying to execute, we're trying to do it really well. And yeah, there's different things that hold the intensity back, but I'm working on like max speed mechanics on day three on
Mhm.
Wednesday. Wicket Wednesdays would often be called, and I'd use wicket drills and some different technical drills to encourage different movement patterns and learn upright posture and how I want them to look in those last four steps. And so in there, at the beginning of the year, they're working on how to accelerate, how to get in those positions, and then what the position should be. And they fill in the gaps over time about how to transition into it. But I'm teaching them how to start and how to finish. And then, from day one, because it takes a long time. It takes a
Mhm.
long time to get those things down. And sometimes, it'll, you can do an amazing job. And sometimes people will click and it'll look like amazing in like 3, 4 weeks. And other people, it'll take 3 years. And sometimes you think about why it did take so long, and it can be a whole lot of complex ways of reasons why. But if you stick to your guns and you have a good model of what it is, and you're willing to be patient and be flexible a little bit about how that person gets there, then if you I think that's where I've got my biggest gains. And, when I
Mhm.
look back at like, oh, this person executed way better, and that's why it's better,
Mhm.
not like, oh, we got our squat better. And, I've never finished a year and thought like, man, we really could have jumped 13 meters if we only had, a 350 pound squat. That would have been all the
Mhm.
difference. I've never thought one time, one moment that was the what was missing.
Mm. And just to contextualize some of what we're saying even more, like you've implemented certain lifts, let's say prior to a technical session. You mentioned that Monday, like where you'll go back to acceleration, and then Tuesday short approach. Like, how will you manipulate the lifting based on that? Because from what I'm gathering here, like the long jump day or short approach day is of particular importance to you. So given that's the case, like how will you avoid fatigue if you are going to lift on a Monday?
Yeah, I might save the heavy squatting or a deadlift or some other like really hard movement for later on the Friday and the Monday. We might do like the cleans, for instance. We're trying to work on all portions of the force time curve. So
Mhm.
what heavy cleans are valuable, lighter, faster cleans are valuable, or using a snatch as a faster velocity. So I might put a snatch on a Monday if I'm trying to make sure they're fresher on Tuesday versus like a heavy clean. If we're doing as far as like, I'll usually have some type of large leg movement where I use a lot of muscle mass, like a clean or a deadlift or something in there. It might be uh, squats with bands, where they're moving it pretty quickly, but it's working on that same movement, and then by doing it on that Monday when we if we need to hit it really heavy, because I think that's important for that individual, then on Friday we're primed a little more from doing it faster on Monday. Or sometimes I've used bottom up lifts and kind of working on the eccentric, the concentric portion of it, and not having as much of an eccentric component on it to create less soreness and fatigue, so that we can have a better day on Tuesday and Wednesday. Because for at least to most people, that might be the priority of, especially when they're trying to learn something new. And if I kill them on a squat and thinking, to kill a squat number up there, and then the next day, it's interesting. I come, I coach throwing. I've coached at high level throwers. I've coached high level sprinters and jumpers. Someone like Anatoly Bondarchuk, for instance, he's a guy that he's a throwing coach. He works on hammer is one of the strongest events that requires the most strength of any event. I mean, when a hammer's at the end of a wire, it's like you're lifting 1,000 pounds. It is extreme strength that's required on that. But in a lot of his training programs, he doesn't go above much like 70 or 80%. And so the people still get stronger, but they're not testing the limits of their strength all the time. And just like repetitive high dosages of moderate weight moved with a high effort can create huge strength improvements, even if you don't get to look on your chart and check off that you hit a higher mark. So I think sometimes we forget that, just frequency of a movement with like a moderate weight and high effort can make as big as strength gains as other things, and it's not going to sacrifice your technique as much. So, with Dr. B, from what I understand, he's trying to improve their technique, and he's lots of different complexities to the program, but he doesn't think it's valuable to use too extreme strength training, and he thinks it's you have to get there eventually, but by testing the limits, it causes a lot of fatigue that can really take like 5 to 7 days, even if you're trying to do a really high effort lift. And that's 5 days, 6 days that you could have been improving your technique. And if it's going downhill, you're basically creating a bad model that you're reinforcing with big heat, right? So, it's like you're putting a big, huge engine in a Honda Accord or something like that, and you're taking a Ferrari engine and putting it in there, and what's going to happen? That engine can put out heat that those tires can't handle, and you're going to be in trouble if you try to push that car's limits.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. I really like that. And yeah, again, just goes back to the priorities that you have in terms of your training organization more than anything versus being attached to like singular methods in themselves, which, you know, can, leave you down a very murky road essentially. And I think that does provide a lot of I suppose, application for coaches listening to this and how they can start to maybe rethink how they do things because I've definitely fallen trapped to it, like, wanting to improve my physical deficits because of insecurities that I have, but staying on that path is very it's very contrary to a lot of the instant gratification that we now seek in today's world, and delaying that kind of I suppose small reward that you might get from cleaning a heavy number is not so enticing, but it's necessary. And even just, your framing of lifting at submaximal loads and improving strength output. I mean, that's a lot of what the velocity based training philosophy gets at nowadays, is that, high intent at submaximal loads will yield absolute strength improvements, which is again a contrary kind of philosophy to what the traditional strength training poses, which is, more plates equals better performance. But it's just not quite that simple, really, when you put it into an equation of a whole week's training.
Yeah, and it's shocking sometimes when some of those you do test people. I had a discus thrower that he threw 57, 75. Finalist at Pan American Games, very good athlete. I didn't ever have her lifting much more than maybe 150 pounds in a bench press, maybe 165. And she was moving it pretty quick, and it was a lot of, she did it 3 days a week in that program. And she went home to Jamaica and went to and her friends were doing maxes, and she's like, "Oh, let me try it out," and lifted more than she'd ever lifted, and lifted, I think it was 265, 200, right around that area in a bench press, and she'd never had more than 165 on the bar at any time for 2 years. So and her strength improved dramatically, even though she never tried it, she never tested it. And so that, you see those kind of things. And, if we had tried and found out, we might have exploited something to get a little bit of a strength gain, but I think we might have lost 3, 4 days of, technique in it. There's other ways to do it that can be really effective too. Some people in throwing world will just lift twice a week. Those days are really hard, but there's enough space in there that they can get the technical components in and improve, and then they also hit the strength components as well. And there's lots of different ways to do it. But I think anytime your model or technical model starts falling apart because of the training you're doing, you got to look at what you're really trying to get better at, and how much sacrifice you are by going down that road. And is it worth the trade-off?
Yeah. When it comes to like, manipulating these variables as it comes close to competition season, I'm wondering like how you begin to space things out based on what your kind of end goal is. People call it tapering and whatnot, but yeah, as it comes into competition season, like what sort of variables are you changing? Obviously, volume is one of them, and by reducing volume, you'll actually enhance intensity because they're a little bit fresher. But something that Dan talks about a lot, and something I only really came into contact with when working with yourself, was like the idea of density as well. I'm interested to know how you play with those things as you get into the competition season.
Yeah, density is a kind of thing where there's sort of like any all of the qualities. There's sort of a period that they need to be touched on in order to improve, and an amount that they need to be done to maintain, and another one that where it starts to drop off. So each of the qualities that you're building have different time periods, right? Aerobic strength, aerobic endurance is you need to hit that more frequently. Maximum strength, you might, if you did it once every 10 days, that would be enough to improve. Maximum speed is maybe once every 10 days. Um, so I think that when you're getting down to peaking seasons, if there's also like an amount of workload that creates a response, and um, if you go down to extremes of that, then you're not going to get much of a response to the training too. So if you start spacing out the density, you can create a workout that causes a response, and also isn't going to create too much fatigue that maybe hamper your competitions. So spacing it out a little bit more can make it so that you're more fresher for those competitions, but you're still doing enough that you're maintaining qualities, or hitting them, or improving them. So with certain people, I might skipping from certain meets to try to get in a little more training. So I try to maybe not compete more than 3 weeks in a row. If in NCAA, it's hard to do that, but so sometimes I'll keep people out of meets in order to keep up the training load. I think one of the things that's really important is that you keep all the qualities in there all the time. So if you like, there used to be idea you build up this big aerobic fitness, and then you start cutting it back in order to get a peak. But if you do that, you tend to lose that quality, and you can never get it back, right? Unless you start the new season. So every season becomes a new, like, one time to get it right. You take away all these things, and by the end of the season, you start losing a lot of the qualities, and you're like, okay, well, why can't you carry it on? If you have all the qualities in there at all times, they tend to stay there for all the way through. And so you might lower the amount and increase the amount. And if someone gets stale, like often, if I have a period where they just train harder, but they're doing the same stuff, everything comes back. But if I've whittled it all and taken it all away, then I can't go back and start adding in extra tempo for someone, if they've lost that quality. So I think having all the qualities in there at all times, whether that's a 7-day cycle or a 10-day cycle or whatever it is, you need to keep all those things in there. So, I look at the competitions, I try to make sure that the athletes are in a position where they can have a decent day for that competition and not lose confidence. So, how I'm setting up the training has a big impact on that. And with someone that's more experienced, maybe it's okay if they could win a competition with a less than optimal run or jump or throw. So they might train through somewhat, and we might push the limits a little more with them, and then they back off a little more for the major needs. So lowering the volumes can definitely cause a freshness, but If you do too much of that, if they're too fresh, then they can't feel anything either. So,
Mm.
like one thing I've tended to find with throwers, I'll tend to keep the volume all the same, and then it's following a certain time period that they're going to adapt to it, and then they get a response, and that's a Bondarchuk kind of idea. With sprinters, I find like they can, if you give them extra rest, but you're still keeping in touch with things, they don't really need to feel it so much. So they may, get a big bounce with a lot more rest. But if you do that with a jumper, they'll tend to maybe their runway will go back 3, 4 feet, and they're totally lost when they're out there. So they need to keep a certain amount of workload consistent. Whereas some of the sprinters, I've given them, a 10-day taper, and they're just kind of touching all the qualities, and then boom, you get a monster result. As the jumper, you might do the same thing and have them capable of a monster result, but they don't know where the hell they are. They can't feel the board, they can't feel their run up, and they're just kind of lost out there. So you might have the potential for a big jump, but you're probably not going to get it because they can't feel.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. And then there's even individuality within each of those events as well. Like some people do need more work within that kind of 10-day period and need to touch on those qualities more consistently than, what you would deem to be the kind of general baseline for people. Have you found that that's ever been something you've had to pay attention to, as I said, individuals within that kind of event category?
Yeah, there is something to that. And then like I find like women, I can kind of keep in touch with intensity more frequently than with men. I'm not as worried about them getting injured as much with intensity as I might be with men. Um, with some things like I find with heptathletes, like I find it surprising sometimes about how much aerobic activity you can keep in there and still have good success in the speed and power events too, as long as you're keeping in touch with those speed and power abilities, right? So, and sometimes I've looked back and I've thought like after some of the athletes have had great success and they improved in some of these qualities, like maybe I had missed some of the keeping in touch with those things with some of the long and triple jumpers, because your intensity is you don't need some of those things, so we just ignore those qualities. So having the right balance of parasympathetic work and sympathetic work is, another physiology idea. And if you just take away a lot of the conditioning, and then it can cause detrimental performance too. So, there's some individuality to it. Um, and the idea generally is women can handle a little more work closer to. And so sometimes I've done things like 7-day taper for a man for the women and 10-day for a man or something, or just depending on, or a 7-day for the men and 5 for the women or something like that. So and as you try these things and you see how it works, you can individualize it some, and maybe you're taking off a run or two, or here for some certain people, and um, there is some individualization to it. But then there's also some principles, and one thing is keeping all the qualities in there. I think makes you able to just try to turn it on or off depending as it goes. And I've had people PR in December and they also PR in September. So it just it just it but it, it's a complex system with all the qualities in there all the way through the whole year.
Mm-hmm. Just represented in different dosages and density patterns and everything like that, but you'll try to touch on them consistently, which I think, yeah, I can agree from having been an athlete of yours. It was like that predictability does kind of in a way create this intangible thing that you can't quite put your finger on, but it's it's allowing for that kind of consistency to take place and not have such massive fluctuations in such a way.
Yeah, and the thing is like, so all you can the big thing is after you can't just do the same thing over and over and over and expect to get results. So it might look a little bit different, but accelerating with you know, um, dragging a tire, and then another time you're accelerating with a 1080, or you're accelerating with some other type of pulley system, like, just changing the stimulus, even though if it is the same quality you're trying to build, will keep away the staleness, right? So even though a program, is, kind of similar in September as what is in July, there's different ways to reach it, right? And like some of the like we look at some of the training, like the Bondarchuk, for instance, like they're trying to get better as you can get in like a 6-week period or an 8-week period, depending on how long the program might run. But it's like, okay, how can we get better to throw this discus further? And then then you come up with a new theory, and then like, okay, now how can we get even further? And there's no like periodization like as in normal things, like we're trying to work on this quality and this quality. All the qualities are in there all the time, and the goal is just how can I get better? And so I think like sometimes with once we built and we're ready to train all the way, which may be in October or November, like just as long as there we can be working on all the same things, but as long as there's like a subtle change in the ways we're getting at them, we're not going to get stale and we're going to keep getting better and better and better. So like, with those training programs, like with Dr. B or something, it's like the goal is it's like the program in September might look exactly, well, very similar to this to how it does in July. There's not like they're not changing periodization based on like some kind of long year-long view. It's like we got a shot in 6 or 8 weeks to be as good as we can get and improve as much as we can. And then we've solved the problem of how we can get even better for another 6 or 8 weeks. And
Mm,
so you basically building like 4 to 7 peaks in a year of just getting better. And
mm,
if the end result is you improve by 3 meters, how you can you might get all of that pretty quickly instead of having to like space it out a whole year and you've got to spend a whole year working on something and then, oh well, what if we did this in September or October differently? I don't remember any of that shit. That was a long time ago. It's just hard to keep track of all those things. And even if you do, like there's so many other factors. So thinking on a whole year-long process of something you did maybe early in the year, it's you can get, like one of the things people say sometimes is you can get, 20 years of experience or with the same experience 20 times.
mm,
What do you want to do? It's just like, you've got to be just giving stimulus changes, even if it is similar volumes, will give big results.
mm. Yeah, definitely. And it's kind of contrary to really how training was looked at a few years ago and is still the case in some setups where we're trying to create this base and the work is so different for a couple of months and then suddenly we integrate a whole host of new qualities because we've established the general fitness, if you want to say. Now we're going into speed because we've got a long year. But your kind of case there is that, once there's subtle tweaks made along the way, there really isn't going to be this big drop off that we predict if we just go specialization, um, or specialized in the beginning, because there are micro, I suppose, shifts within each of those forms of specificity, if you want to say.
Yeah, it's like you could do it where you're almost detraining away from your goal and doing all this stuff that isn't really that important, and then you try to change it, and you could maybe get healthy because you never really got your best, if you know what I mean. Detrained yourself and you just kept away from doing speed work, and then all of a sudden we put in the speed work, and sometimes you just blow up because you're not used to doing the training, that type of
Mm-hmm.
training, right? So, the way I try to do things is we're doing that type of training like from day one, and then you're doing different changes in order for it not to be stale. And there is a subtle progression, say when I'm doing like a jump or a sprint program, to increase the intensity and add different things so we're ready to handle the most of the most important workouts.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not detraining doing something that's totally unimportant and then trying to add it back in. And that, the the preparation for speed is speed, just controlled environment or something, or and then you're working on the technique, and because it is slowed a little bit, maybe because you're on the grass, then it allows you to work on technique a little bit easier sometimes, and then you add the speed and the intensity to it, you got a good model that holds. But if I detrain you by doing something that's totally counterproductive, thinking that, and something's going to hold there, they end up pulling all those qualities out. Okay, now we need to take out the tempo, and then whatever you built from there is gone already. So what did you do? You just wasted your time. Prepare for doing your main important event by doing the main thing.
Mm-hmm. Uh, we've kind of looked at the technical model. We've looked at the training. The last thing I want to kind of touch on with you is what you've been doing lately. You've been putting up some really nicely informed posts to shape a lot of your ideas that you've discussed here. Um, and I'm interested, how can people learn more about what you're doing at the moment? Because if I may say for yourself, you've started coaching online and taking on new athletes. Um, so yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've been able to spend a little more time without the NCAA system where you're constantly spending time recruiting and traveling and doing so much. I've had a little more free time to think about my ideas and express a little bit more and things like that online. So yeah, I'm doing a lot of remote coaching, and I plan on doing some in person as well here in Orlando. And so yeah, I've just just trying to keep I do online programs and remote programs where you will people will be training and they'll send me videos regularly and they're getting regular feedback about how to things that they can improve. And then next week they send some more videos of those kind of things. And so I've been surprised how quickly things can change. And I think sometimes the accountability of you having to do it on your own out there on those days can increase the amount of attention span that people have. And so, that accountability, and part of it is the people that choose to train like that are different type of people that are self-motivated and have a certain accountability to do it. But there also creates some because you have to do it for yourself out there. And sometimes as a coach, we people try to tinker and thinking like, oh, I'm changing everything by saying cues on every single rep, and a lot of times that's you know it's false. It's a partial, it's a temporary fix, and because there is so much feedback on every rep, it doesn't stay, and he doesn't really remember it. So there's some different things that you can do with that type of training program, and it's been interesting to watch it happen and see how much change you can get from just phone calls and Zoom meetings and text messages over WhatsApp.
Yeah, like some of the infographics you've been putting up are really good. Like you can see that the person's able to hit really, really nice shapes without you being there in person, which is so cool to see. And I think it is a perspective shift for many out there that might be kind of resistant to working with someone um, online, but it's a testament to obviously your knowledge and what you're able to bring to the table. So I'd like you to share like how can people get in touch with you because they may want to avail of your services.
Yeah, you could on Instagram at Glenn Smith with two N's, 996. Instagram. My Twitter is Coach G Smith, I believe, or X, I guess. Or you could email me at gpsmith2051 at gmail.com.
Great. Yeah, no, it's been lovely to chat the last hour and a bit, Glenn, like always, talking about, all things training and really wish you all the success in the world with, taking on this new project of yours and I hope athletes and coaches out there are keen to get in touch with Glenn because I can tell you from my personal perspective and having worked with Glenn for many years and still just talking to him as a coach who's trying to develop, it's been life changing for me. So I want to say personally, thank you, Glenn, for all you've done for me. And yeah, from the bottom of my heart, like I really, really hope that this flourishes into something great.
Thank you, Colin. Yeah, it's been fun to chat, and yeah, it's always enjoyable talking about this kind of stuff, and so with someone that can, as educated as yourself about it, that can challenge me in those ways.
Yeah, well, I suppose I was one of the athletes that in the beginning was interested in the technical side, and that's why I was gravitating towards you and not caring so much about where I was going in the US in Monroe, Louisiana. I was just first and foremost interested in where I was going to get better, and that's it's great when you do get to work with an athlete like that, and I have one right now, and that's a joy. But as you mentioned in the very beginning, like you're thinking about those communication styles and everything like that to nurture athletes and get them to buy into your program. And I think that is very, very important and something I hope to talk a lot more about on this podcast. But yeah, as I said, over the last hour, it's been great to talk all things training with you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on.